I bet you had no idea there was a war on the West being raged right now. But that is, in fact, the subtitle of a book penned by British writer Douglas Murray. So either it must be true, or it's merely attempting to awaken the boogeyman known as anti-wokeism. The British style of this movement is the affirmation of the old narratives of British imperialist history against the tide of change in public opinion against it. Murray, who has no credentials as a historian, by the way, paints a picture of British history that is an unwavering flattery of empire. That is not his only agenda. He breeds contempt for any and all in opposition of his idea, including those with ties to the former colonies. That is possibly connected to his long-standing opposition to immigration and his criticism of Islam. But I digress. Murray's latest writing borrows from the greatest hits of the American alt-right movement, whose ideology has now metastasized throughout the English-speaking world. That ideology courts social acceptability for a kindler, gentler version of white supremacy. The British wing of this movement is an increasingly angry defensive response to any criticism of Britain's imperial past, of land thefts, pillaged cultures, enslaved and exploited people and other cultures under the guise of civilizing the world. The main argument is that those who oppose this official version of history are anti-Western woke warriors who are orchestrating an attack on the West and therefore posing a threat to Western, read white, power. The British anti-wokeism movement recently picked up steam following the felling of a statue of slave trader William Colston in Bristol. A more accurate description of Colston is as a mass murderer and seller of human souls who somehow got venerated for having donated some of his ill-gotten gains to the city of Bristol, where his statue stood. That is plain evidence that the lives Colston affected with his philanthropy mattered more than the lives he destroyed. The debate about whether the statue should have remained standing became representative of the current culture of polarized debate on anything, including the veneration of mass murderers, apparently. The anti-wokeism crowd soon moved in to create a campaign to protect statues of Churchill, which stood in London amongst other places, where his figure was covered by graffiti with the words racist painted on him. Churchill is better known for fighting Nazism, to be fair, and much of that is indisputable. But for certain of his actions and statements as he presided over the British Empire, Churchill was recognized as a racist, even by his own contemporaries. To Murray and his version of history, this is nothing as simple as presenting another angle of a man who was infamously and notably flawed in many other ways, as well as being rightly recognized as heroic for standing up to the Nazis. But the part of the discussion of Churchill's life that did not fit previous neat narratives was framed as an attack on Britain's greatest man, and by extension, an attack on Britain itself. This is a neat trick, since few had ever heard a dissenting narrative of one of Britain's endearing heroes. It'd be easy to frame any discussion of Churchill's cultural chauvinism as changing your history. But the attempt to bring one of Britain's heroes into the fight against the so-called war on the West demonstrates a somewhat deliberate attempt to attract people who would not otherwise give a damn about this culture war. Churchill's statue was spray-painted, but there was never any campaign by Black Lives Matter or anyone else to take the statue down like Colston's. But if they had, so what? We're talking about statues here, pieces of metal. I shudder to think that these metal figures are valued more than the people who died during the slave trade or the Bengal famine in India presided over by the British bulldog. But perhaps that's what Black Lives Matter actually means. Murray and his ilk are promoting the continuation of dangerous underlying attitudes underpinning the British Empire. The kind of cultural superiority embodied in Kipling's White Man's Burden is finally being seen in a clear light of day in a more multicultural and socially conscious Britain generations later, even if Kipling's worldview has not completely disappeared from the British education system, the media, and government policy. That is true particularly of the present government, by the way, that is dabbling in culture wars to deflect from its mismanagement of the pandemic, Brexit, endemic corruption, the recent skyrocketing cost of living. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, much like Murray, his fellow Etonian and Oxford alumnus, shares Murray's point of view that any present condemnation of Britain's history is running Britain down, as he says. But even Murray has to concede that some of that history is not a good look. Slavery, for example, was bad, he admits, especially for the enslaved. That's brilliant. But then Murray extols another popular point of the alt-right, that slavery had its good points too. Who knew? Murray might actually expect the African diaspora to be grateful for the way the global sale of human beings aided the dispersal of African peoples around the world, though the transport was paid for by the labor of their ancestors. But this sanitized version of slaves as unpaid indentured workers glosses over the tragedy of abduction, confinement, torture, and rape that the people of African origin commonly endured. Murray then reaches for a desperate justification for European enslavement of Africans. Everyone else did it, especially Muslims, as he suspiciously is quick to point out. So I guess that makes British participation blameless for its own participation in crimes against humanity. Murray does not tolerate we woke warriors using the word genocide to describe the estimated 15 million people who died in the transatlantic slave trade, apparently, as there never was a deliberate attempt to kill those slaves. They were chattel to be sold to the highest bidder, after all, worth considerable amounts of money, alive and healthy. Interesting point. But that probably also explains why many of these captives were thrown overboard during the mid-Atlantic journey to drown or to be devoured by sharks, if, in the likely case scenario, they developed serious disease from being chained to each other naked in the ship's cargo hold. That deterioration of their health lowered the monetary value of that human cargo, you see. But rather than reflect on this historically diabolical disregard for human life, it's a much better thing that Britain credit itself for leading the abolitionist mission. Murray seems to claim redemption for Britain, for its part. It played in ending the oppression rather than the harm caused by the oppression itself. That alt-right movement in the United States also seems to disown huge tracts of its history. Only a small number of the so-called elite bought and owned slaves, they say, and that awful history can be disowned by mainstream America. This reframing of American history ignores the cruel legacy of segregation which divided land, educational opportunities, job prospects, and justice unequally, and dished out harsh state-sponsored abuse and violence against the descendants of slaves for centuries after emancipation, in a system designed to advantage all whites by keeping all others in their place. Of course, there are many Brits who would want to differentiate themselves from this sad history of segregation that occurred in the United States, believing that no such things happened under British rule. Yet, a British imperialist was a key founder of a system of apartheid in southern Africa that was arguably more oppressive than the American version. The Indian subcontinent, Caribbean, and North and Sub-Saharan Africa withstood the ransacking of its cultural property and resources in the name of the British Crown. Never mind. According to Murray and the alt-right, all of this is all in the past. So forgive me if I interpret this to mean that mass murder, invasion, and genocide were at some point socially acceptable, unlike in this woke world we live in, where we reject such human cruelty. Now, by this point, I should digress to provide a definition of wokeness, given the frequency which I've used the expression. Unfortunately, few of those people who throw this term around ever provide clear guidance on what they mean. Wokeness, originally meant to describe anti-racism, has been rebranded as wokeism by the culturally superior who wish things to remain as they have been, in their favor. Their strategy is to turn the tables. The formerly oppressed and their sympathizers are now the oppressor, waging war on everything the benevolent state of Britain has ever stood for. The declaration of the so-called war on the West is useful for people who want to divide the country into us and them, and stoke the anger of those here in Britain who understood the British Empire to be a useful example of British superiority. Even its self-proclaimed right to invade other territories occurred, apparently, for their own good. Most justifications for invasions now are seen as clearly for the steaming load of bullshit that they are in the light of more recent world events. See Vladimir Putin. Or you could also try this analogy on for size, as the British radio commentator James O'Brien did on his program. He challenged his listeners to take some of the alt-right and anti-woke arguments about the treatment of minorities in the West and put those words in the mouth of a contemporary German, indulging in nostalgia about the Nazis. The Holocaust, he or she might then argue, was not so bad. Jews had been persecuted in many societies throughout history. If everyone persecuted them, then that would make what the Nazis did less repugnant, doesn't it? Don't forget, good things came out of the Nazi period too. Look at how the Jewish people got spread all over the world. Nazis built an empire that stretched across Europe, demonstrating their superiority. To say anything else is anti-German. Statues of Hitler should have been allowed to stand because taking them down is an attempt to change our history. You see? Such a narrative of German history, besides sounding ridiculous, would never survive the light of day. Partly because modern Germany has faced its past, even if that's partly because it was so roundly condemned by Western allies. But Germany has faced up to its ugly past nonetheless, so that one of the most progressive societies in Europe could emerge out of that reckoning. It's also because when most people in the West discuss Nazi Germany, it involves the use of the word them. The English-speaking world sees them as perpetrators. The reckoning of the past of Britain and that of other European colonizers is harder to swallow because it often involves the use of the word us. Anti-wokeism threatens to merge into the American alt-right movement. This is because the idea is so easy for the electorate to chomp on, rewarding politicians who advance it. Create an us and them divide. Declare yourself as one of us, provide subtle clues that we are better than them, and then declare war on them. Or better yet, declare them as a threat to us, and as Murray has done. Such a strategy can take you to the White House or Downing Street, supported by a media that acts as its pliant propaganda mouthpiece. That's as far as this anti-wokeness can go. Perhaps it's clear now why Douglas Murray, the right-wing press in Britain, and even the British government are taking some pages out of this American playbook. Because it works so well.